Good morning. I know people are refreshing their coffee, and once you have a seat, we'll get started. There are, I think, maybe 2 or 3 chairs at the table, which I encourage people to come to the table, since at the end of the program, we're really going to have a interactive discussion. So those of you in the sort of back row will be at a disadvantage. So this is your chance. Our panelists are very friendly, and there's a couple of chairs at the front corner here. Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Caroline Chang. I'm the director of the DC office of the Penn Wharton Public Policy Initiative. I wanted to say thanks to this great group of speakers this morning. I will turn it over momentarily to Christopher Yu, whom all of you know. But I did want to take the opportunity to just give you a quick overview of the Penn Wharton Public Policy Initiative. We do have some materials on the front table as you came in, and if you didn't happen to sign in or check off your name, please do on your way out, just so we can make sure we know who was in the room today. But the Penn Wharton Public Policy Initiative is really very quite pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with the CTIC, sort of a sister organization on campus at Penn. The Public Policy Initiative covers a wide range of policy issue areas, everything that intersects with business and the economy. So today's topic is certainly one very fast-moving and interesting topic that fits that bill. And we really focus our work here. We have a Philadelphia office as well as our DC office. We really focus on bringing data-driven research and analysis into the policy dialogues here in DC. So that's a big piece of our work. Today's conversation, again, is a great example of that. So just real quick housekeeping matters. Everybody, I think, should have gotten a little card at your chair with the Wi-Fi code. If anybody needs that or doesn't have it, I can keep this number at the sign-in table. And then other than that, I know some people have been struggling to find the facilities, which are kind of down the hall back, as you were coming in, by the old phone booths there. So in case you're wondering. But if there's no other questions, I want to get the program started. We have a great panel, great discussion opportunity. So let me introduce Christopher Yu, who will kick us off.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you to the Penn Wharton Public Policy Initiative. It is one that spans all of Penn in all the different aspects, whether it's healthcare, tax policy, any one of a number of things. I encourage you, if you follow any of these other issues or these issues, to keep in touch with them. They're committed to data-based policymaking in a way that I think is emphasized. It's something that academics can bring to enrich the debate. That would be always very helpful. We're very delighted to have such a distinguished group. This is an issue, as you know, that's become very important. Anyone who's seen the projections for the future, fixed line subscriptions and data usage and the projections are all flat. Wireless is going through the roof. People will get in discussions about what the future is going to look like, and it's pretty clear that wireless is going to has grown as a role and will continue to play an increasingly important role. But in fact, the way wireless is merging is also becoming much more complex. We're seeing people migrate and shed load onto Wi-Fi networks seamlessly, and what we're seeing now is the growth of small cells. It's a very, very different world than it was, for example, in 2010 when the FCC issued the order that was struck down this earlier in January. So I'm particularly delighted to have this program put together and to have a broad range of perspectives from technical to economic to legal in ways that I hope will be informative and add something important that hasn't been brought out in the debate yet. But before we get to the substance of that part of the program, the panelists, we are fortunate to have Meredith Atwell Baker, the president and CEO of the CTIA, the Wireless Association, to kick us off. Anyone who's been involved in communications policy knows Meredith and knows her well. Among her many positions she's held in the past has been acting assistant secretary for Commerce for Communication Information, acting administrator of NTIA, commissioner of the FCC, senior vice president in government affairs in NBC Universal before taking the helm of CTIA. And I can think of no one better to help us frame the discussion we're about to have from an academic side, from someone who understands the industry better than anyone. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Caroline and Chris. I really think that our debates and our discussions in this city are always better when you join us from UPenn. And no debate needs more thoughtful leadership than this one right here that we're going to have to talk about today. I really want to thank you for organizing this event. You always bring heavy hitters and meaningful conversation, and today looks like that will not change at all. We have a great panel, and I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts on why and whether wireless technology should be regulated differently. You will not be surprised at my answer to that question. My answer, of course, is yes, and if you want it in a different language, I can say, si, oui, ya. So it is our competitive, our operational, and technological differences that warrant a mobile-specific approach. And you won't be surprised to hear me say the following. The continuous cycle of mobile innovation is not only delighting U.S. consumers, it's a major force in driving economic growth, boosting U.S. competitiveness, and enabling solutions to challenges like education and healthcare. But those words are not mine. They belong to Chairman Tom Wheeler. He wrote them about 3 weeks ago in a blog post, which was entitled Meeting the Mobile Moment. I really recommend it to everyone. It captures really effectively the challenge and the opportunity we face as a nation to ensure our wireless leadership remains unmatched. The chairman laid out 3 pillars of his mobile agenda, and we strongly agree with all of them. Number 1, making more spectrum available. Number 2, using technology and market forces to more effectively use spectrum. And number 3, promoting mobile infrastructure deployment. Chairman Wheeler's 3 pillars recognize that our wireless ecosystem is incredibly dynamic and that the U.S. once again has the mobile momentum. It is undeniable that America now leads the world in wireless. Our networks and our mobile ecosystem are envied around the globe. Right now, wireless innovation is flourishing across all sectors of our economy. Remember when wireless was just voice and text? Well, now mobile is video, health, retail, energy conservation, and connected everything from cars and appliances to pacemakers and farm equipment. That means rising demand on our wireless networks. Mobile data traffic has grown over 700% between 2010 and 2013. And the growth trends remain staggering as more and more devices get connected and usage increases, which means we need more spectrum, hundreds of megahertz more, cleared and some shared too, licensed and unlicensed, low band and high band, and everything in between. We must leave no airwave unturned, and we start looking today. I applaud the chairman for recognizing without strong government support to promote more investment and innovations, others will jump ahead of us in the race to 5G and our connected life. Policymakers have begun to take on some important steps. Next month's AWS-3 auction is a critical first step. Then our attention is going to turn to the broadcast incentive auction. My optimism for the incentive auction has increased with the FCC's recent release of the Greenhill Report. The report gives broadcasters a better sense of what this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity can mean for them financially. A policy debate is finally shifting into a business calculus for the 2,100 plus broadcasters across the country. And as broadcasters begin to evaluate the options the auction presents, they can rest assured that the spectrum-hungry wireless carriers will be at that auction with billions in bids. To ensure the United States continues its global leadership, we also need a forward-looking spectrum policy for 2020 and beyond. Thanks to the best engineers in the world, U.S. providers are the global leaders in 4G and LTE. A remarkable achievement, especially since the U.S. has the 3rd lowest amount of spectrum available and deployed for LTE. Technical advances in the marketplace are now expanding the range of spectrum and the frequencies that are suitable for mobile use. So Chairman Wheeler's announcement that the FCC will begin exploring the use of spectrum above 24 gigahertz at Friday's meeting deserves more attention. We can never and will never ignore that the continued need for more spectrum under 3 gigahertz. But we also need to expand our search to find complementary spectrum, as the FCC will start doing this week. And while spectrum snags the headline, Mobile infrastructure, the chairman's third pillar, is often overlooked. Our members have seen firsthand how expensive and time-consuming the existing regulatory burdens for deployment can be. When infrastructure falls behind, when towers can't be upgraded or small cells deployed, consumers' wireless experience inevitably suffers. CTIA called on the FCC for quick and decisive action on infrastructure reform, and the Commission is delivering. The FCC's expected ruling will facilitate smarter and faster infrastructure deployment. This is important, and we are grateful. I hope we can continue to concentrate on the chairman's three pillars to drive a pro-consumer and pro-economy wireless agenda beyond October. Nothing would make me happier than to discuss how wireless connectivity enables our 21st century mobile lives. We can and we should all focus our collective resources to locate the next 100, 200, 300 megahertz of spectrum to keep our industry and our economy growing. Unfortunately, we find ourselves consumed yet again with net neutrality. CTIA and our members fully support an open internet, and our consumers demand it. We believe in internet openness and always will. It is a business imperative. Any regulations governed by flexible policies that are reflective of the mobile extremely competitive market, unrelenting innovation and investment, and be designed for the unique challenges that our networks face, millisecond by millisecond. In other words, getting back to today's topic, yes, wireless should be regulated differently because wireless is different. The FCC has consistently, time and time again, recognized the simple fact. The result? A mobile ecosystem leading the world and a consumer base benefiting from the continual innovation and investment. Yet some now demand that the FCC force rules designed for a fixed broadband market onto wireless. This ill-advised call for platform parity reflects a troubling disconnect. We have spent a great deal of time in the past month, with Dr. Reed's help, to underscore the technical reasons why mobile is different, why mobile service requires nimble and dynamic network management, how wireless providers depend on limited spectrum resources. Importantly, more than just technical reasons justify retention of a mobile-specific approach. Our industry is fiercely competitive, and that competition is driving new services, offerings, and differentiation that benefits consumers. 97% of Americans have 3 or more mobile options, and more than 8 out of 10 can choose from 4 or more. The competitive nature of mobile provides an important backdrop for issues like net neutrality. If carriers implement practices that aren't consumer-friendly, consumers will vote with their feet and move to another provider. This marketplace strives to deliver greater and greater value to consumers, and the FCC should give pause before taking away consumer options or the drive to experiment in the competitive marketplace. Beyond competitive differences, mobile remains very much an early-stage technology, the benefits and applications of which we are only just beginning to witness. VoLTE, LTE broadcast, LTE advanced, connected life devices and applications, all are on their way. This dynamic and evolving nature of mobile must be reflected in the rules as well. GM just wrote a letter to the FCC expressing concerns about the future of connected car under the wrong net neutrality regime. That should give everyone pushing strict platform parity pause. So, given the multiple fundamental ways in which mobile is different, the suggestion that a broad definition of reasonable network management, standing alone, is all that is needed to capture mobile broadband's differences is faulty. We need truly mobile-specific rules, just as we had in 2010. When the U.S. mobile broadband platform is thriving, and as the chairman has recognized, competitive markets yield better outcomes than regulated markets, why would we move now to layer on more intrusive regulation? If we treat wireless like fixed broadband, we will not only fail to meet the mobile moment, we may lose it for a generation. And the stakes could not be higher, because countries around the world are looking for the next generation of mobile, 5G, not merely as a wireless technology, but as a key input for economic growth. These countries, eager to supplant us, are designing policies to incent wireless investment on their turf. We must do the same, or we risk innovation exported overseas and investment squandered. When mobility threads innovation across nearly every industry sector, the potential consequences of falling behind are stark. Strict platform parity is a significant and unnecessary danger. Consumers have greatly benefited, as have networks, app providers, and OEM under the balanced mobile-specific 2010 rules. Now, as our connected life is poised to take off, we should double down on that approach and not walk away from it. The other core danger in this proceeding is calls to regulate mobile broadband under Title II. As a policy matter, using Title II to regulate wireless is misguided and contrary to clear congressional intent. Title II would generate years of otherwise avoidable litigation that the FCC would likely lose after years of wrangling, particularly with respect to mobile broadband, a non-CMRS service. There is simply no need to reopen settled statutory classification decisions. Hybrid approaches, forbearance models, and other legal complexities can't salvage those flawed legal theories. Meeting the mobile moment requires open internet rules under Section 706. This is an important issue for the economy and consumers across the country, and particularly for low-income families and communities of color who are at significant risk if we miss the mobile moment. Recent data shows mobile broadband is critical to African Americans and Hispanics in particular. These communities rely on their mobile devices to access the internet at a higher rate. For 90% of Hispanics that depend on smartphones today, for the 90% of African Americans that call wireless an essential service today, for the 100% increase since 2010 in low-income residents using mobile broadband, wireless service as the critical communication link, as a technology that has helped bridge the digital divide, as a service that drives adoption in underserved areas, and the preferred platform for a growing number of Americans. 1 out of 10 Americans' only internet connection is a smartphone. 45 million Americans use mobile phones as their primary internet access device. We can thank the Obama administration's FCC for recognizing 4 years ago that a light touch, mobile-specific approach to the open internet was warranted. Since then, communities of color have fully embraced wireless broadband. With wireless taxes and fees already astronomical, the last thing mobile users need is the government's thumb producing more obstacles to mobile adoption and innovation. I am heartened to see important voices, like the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, express concerns with shifting away from the current regulatory framework for mobile broadband. Just this week, the Hispanic Chamber's CEO said the FCC would be wise not to disrupt the successful wireless market and should resist making regulatory changes that would impede the Hispanic community's increasing reliance on mobile services. The mobile-specific framework is working to get more Americans online and connected. Some have attempted to argue the opposite and the need to avoid 2 internets. In their view, because some groups depend more on mobile broadband, we need to apply fixed rules to it. We disagree. The FCC needs to maintain the approach that has enabled a robust wireless competition and provided opportunities for millions to get online for the first time. The success of mobile broadband as a tool for connectivity calls for continued regulatory restraint, not a drastic shift towards public utility regulation. Under the current open internet framework, mobile carriers offer over 100 plans, including entry-level plans to attract new users. Carriers have deployed new pro-consumer features like music freedom and sponsored data to provide more value to consumers. This kind of differentiation is key to the hyper-competitive mobile market. Consumers win when competitors vie to see who can manage the best network and optimize the most service for the most subscribers. We don't want to lose that. Zero rating is part of that differentiation. As many of you know, zero rating gives consumers the ability to access content without it counting towards their service plan. The disconnect in our debate over net neutrality may be best evidenced by the degree of venom at zero rating. Some self-proclaimed consumer advocates call it the real threat for net neutrality and a practice that needs to be banned. Language is important, and the label zero rating has taken on a negative connotation. Let's start calling it what it is for the consumer: free, or at least toll-free. And what does it do? It promotes adoption, drives broadband usage, provides a platform for new services to find an audience, and enhances an overall consumer welfare. Ultimately, it underscores how competitive the wireless industry is today as operators try to find new ways to attract and retain subscribers. This discussion of market differentiation, innovative new service plans, and how we can ensure the most powerful mobile broadband experience for all consumers brings us back to where we started, with Spectrum and the chairman's 3 pillars. That should be our focus as we seek to meet our mobile moment. On net neutrality, let us pledge to do no harm to the framework that has unlocked billions in investment across the mobile ecosystem and connected consumers whenever and wherever they want. A mobile-specific framework that reflects the technological, competitive, and operational differences of today's 4G networks and the 5G networks of tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith, for reminding us that this issue of open internet is taking place in a much broader question of spectrum policy and other issues that really are as important for the long-term health of this industry. And actually, thank you, Meredith, perfectly for framing up the fact that there are important technical, business, and legal constraints that are going to affect, that will shape the way we have this debate, which provides, in my opinion, the perfect entree for our next presentation, which is Jeff Reed is the Willis G. Worcester Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Virginia Tech, where he also is serves as the director of an initiative known as Wireless at Virginia Tech. He received his PhD also in electrical and computer engineering from UC Davis, has experience not only on the academic side, but as a private sector entrepreneur in a number of ventures, both while he was going through his schooling and into today. So thank you, and thank you for joining us. I should also say one other thank you. I forget, we are live streaming this, so as we get to the Q&A period, we will have a microphone. Do we have a microphone we'll pass around? And we should thank the Internet Society, which has generously offered to live stream this and provide it and make it available to their members. So without further ado, Professor Reed.
Thank you.
Are they all queued up, the slides?
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk about this very important topic. Okay, so my focus is going to be on the technical differences between wireless and wireline systems. And for some of you, this may be very new material. For others of you, this is probably going to be, of course, very simplistic. But the important point that I want you to take away from my presentation is that these technical differences are very significant, and hence the wireless regulatory framework needs to be very different than the wireline framework because of these technical differences. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about these technical differences, and then at the end I'll tell you how I think that these technical differences should influence policy. And of course, the first technical difference is the scarcity of spectrum, the limited amount of bandwidth that we have to support our wireless systems, especially compared to wireline systems like fiber optics. If you took all of the bandwidth from 0 to 3 gigahertz, which would not only include all of the cellular bandwidth, but also broadcast, military, public safety, and much of the Wi-Fi, and you put that all together, that would just be a fraction of the bandwidth that is available for fiber optic systems. And what this means is that the way that you design these systems is very different because of the availability of bandwidth. And for wireless systems, it's all about preserving your bandwidth. It's a very complex structure, many subsystems that are composing wireless systems. And each one of those subsystems has some element of it, of preserving and managing bandwidth. Sometimes I've heard people say, well, you could just put an exception for proper management of bandwidth. Well, everything is centered around preserving a bandwidth. The other aspect, of course, is the dynamic channel conditions. In a wireline system, it's a fairly static channel. But in a wireless system, as we all know, signals come in and out due to blockage. They are disrupted by interference from other cellular systems that may be in or out of their network. It could be interference due to the lights in the ceiling. And hence, you have to actively manage that network. Sometimes you just don't have the amount of bandwidth that you would hope that you would have, or you would expect that you would have, because of these interference issues. And because you have a limited bandwidth, and this is a very important point, you have to manage that bandwidth. You have to manage this bandwidth according to the applications. For instance, voice is very sensitive to latency. It's very sensitive to delays. And I'm sure almost everyone here has made a satellite telephone call, and you'll know when you make a satellite telephone call because you start speaking on top of the other person. And that's because of the latency involved in going to a geosynchronous satellite to reach the destination. Latency is very important in speech. You start talking on top of each other, or you start to interpret a person's words differently because of delays in speech. Likewise, in real-time gaming, latency is a very important issue to be able to support that type of application. Now, downloading a web page. A web page, if you have a delay of a second or two, you're probably not going to notice. If you have a delay of 100 milliseconds or more with speech, you will notice. So you have to manage the type of data that you put on this network, and you have to give prioritization to certain applications in order to have the best consumer experience. I oftentimes hear, why should the service providers do that? Why isn't my video or why isn't my gaming more important than this person's phone conversation? Well, and that's a good question. Somebody's got to make the decisions about prioritization of traffic, and the service providers are in the best position to do that. They want to make their customers happy. They'll look at the psychological aspects of the application and the quality of service that is needed, and they will make those hard decisions. Mobility adds a lot of complexity to the network, and it also influences the way in which resources are allocated. Sometimes you may find that you'll be traveling in your car and your call will get dropped. That's really irritating. And part of the reason that sometimes occurs is that there's not enough resources at the next base station in which you're supposed to be handed over to. There's a reserve capacity that helps in transitioning this handover so that the bandwidth is available to make sure that call is completed, but sometimes it doesn't happen. That's very irritating. It's probably more irritating than not being able to make your initial call, and I'm sure that's happened to all of us here. You get blocked. Blocking's been happening in cellular systems for, 30-something years as far as I know, maybe even before our analog AMPS standard. Blocking occurs because there's not a capacity available to the network. And it's much more psychologically better to continue a call than to have a person hit the send button twice. So you have to make these decisions based upon the situation, based upon the application. The network capacity and growth of cellular systems is hampered, of course, by spectrum. But there's a lot of things beyond just technical reasons for the hampering of growth. You have to acquire real estate, you have to be able to create backhaul, that is the connection from the base station into the core network. These are all the issues that make it difficult to grow capacity. The coexistence, it's amazing that our networks are able to support devices that are now close to 30 years old. It's just amazing. Those devices, though, like the one I have for my father-in-law, he has one of the early CDMA candy bar phones. I can't pry it out of his hands. He just is going to keep that phone. Of course, that phone is probably chewing up at least 30 times the capacity as a modern phone, and we support that. But it also makes it difficult for managing resources. The technology is evolving very rapidly. And I'm smart enough to know that I don't know how things are going to work out, what technologies and what applications will be successful, which ones will be failures. I can tell you that likely it's going to be very disruptive. Having regulations that can disrupt based upon hypothetical applications or hypothetical situations is very dangerous. So there's a number of differences, and I think for the sake of time, I'll not go into all of these. But the response to capacity demand, this is something in which wireless has to manage the traffic dynamically with prioritization, scheduling, and power allocation. In a wireline systems, the question may be about prioritizing application, but in a wireless system, it's more fundamental than that. Can I serve this application given the conditions that the user is in? And oftentimes, the scheduling of this, the prioritization is given to serving the user while he's in a good position and has a good channel. You try to service him if you can, and you wait on those who are in a disadvantaged channel. The reason for that is that you can have overall greater network capacity by doing that. So you may have to sacrifice somebody in terms of latency, but if you look at the overall picture, you can improve the overall capacity of the network if you make those balances. The networks themselves are very dynamic. I'm going to go into this in just a bit more and tell you a little bit about where the future is going and the complexity of future operations, the complexity of new network management techniques that are coming. But the service providers are always getting updates to their system. They're always tweaking the systems. The performance is changing. It generally increases, but they also do antenna tilting. Sometimes, and this happens on occasion, an area that was well served at one time becomes less well served because they have to point the antenna to where the traffic is at. Now these are very dynamic things that happen. They're day-to-day operations. When you try to quantify the performance of the network with singular points, it's just quite misleading. I wanted to give you an idea of where we're at. Oftentimes I've heard that wireless, now that LTE has been out there, wireless is pretty stable. We know what we have now. Now it's time to regulate it more like a telephone company, a POTS. And it really isn't. There are a number of new technologies that are coming down the road, and the increases in capacity and data throughput are going to be increasing substantially over the years. These are standards. You could think of a release as an upgrade in your operating system of your computer, going from Windows Vista to Windows 8 as an example. It's a major upgrade. And of course, there are minor upgrades along the way. Release 8 represents LTE, the baseline LTE, the first LTE that was introduced. Notice that standard was frozen in 2009. And it usually takes a year or two before you start to see product, and several years before you start to see it on a mass scale. Release 13 is expected to be frozen in March 2016. And by the way, these things get delayed, usually. So we'll see probably the mass introduction of it, I'm guessing 2019. And within Release 13, as an example, they're expecting to have mobile-to-mobile communications, direct mobile-to-mobile, kind of like a walkie-talkie. There will be spectrum sharing. One of the things likely to happen in Release 13 is unlicensed LTE, where it shares the same band as Wi-Fi, and private LTE networks could be established, or the carriers might choose to use unlicensed spectrum, and all of the pitfalls that have to go with unlicensed spectrum. You know, you like licensed spectrum better because you can control the quality of service, but when you're desperate, you use everything you can, including unlicensed spectrum. If we start putting in a regulatory framework now, I'm sure we're going to box ourselves in on future standards in the future technology directions. We just don't know. If you could bring up that second document, I have another document there. I wanted to give you.
What? Chrome. It's in Chrome, yeah, but it's not giving us, it's going to the
Okay, this is not giving you a page number. I took this from the webpage of 3GPP. This is the standardization organization. And within it also has this the predecessor standardization activity even prior to 3G. It also covers 4G. This particular web page is the 3GG specification releases. These are changes in the specification that occur. You could start scrolling. This thing is 136 pages long. Okay, and each one of these is a new element of the standard. Go down to page 23. Unfortunately, if you see this in Adobe, you see the page numbers, but just keep going. You're about halfway. Oh, you can see it on the side there. Go to 23. Oh, okay, now we're getting there. Those last 6 columns there, those represent, go to about 23. Yeah, oh, okay. Yeah, it's showing. Those last 6 columns right here, these are the ones for LTE, for release 8 all the way up to release 16, okay? This is it, we're page 23 of the specifications. This goes to 160 something pages. So almost all of the remaining pages, those remaining 140 something pages, are specifications for LTE and the changes of the specifications between now and 2016. Everything above that is 2G and 3G, okay, 4G. It's just amazing how complex these systems are compared to the previous systems, how rapidly they're changing, the details that are involved in this. This is something that just a regulator is not going to be able to get their arms around. And much of it is dealing with radio resource management. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. And I'll try to speed it up. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, policy implications. Technology and future applications are very difficult to predict. What will be the killer app? You know, video right now seems to be the killer app. Video downloads are the killer app. My gut feeling is video uploads are the next killer app of having people collect information. That actually is going to be very disruptive in terms of the way that we manage these networks. And it's actually going to cause more congestion, by the way. I've seen a lot of hypothetical problems that don't have any existence today being addressed with hypothetical regulations for hypothetical systems which are yet to be defined. And people want to make rules based upon that. Scares me. The transparency rules. Transparency is always a good word, but you also have to be careful with it. There are such things as trade secrets. There's a lot of flexibility within the standards. And service providers spend lots of money doing R&D to make their secret sauce that makes them better than their competitor. So you want to be able to preserve that competitive nature. Also, performance metrics. And I've seen some of the language for performance networks for wireless systems. Again, it's overly simplistic. It talks about measuring throughput. Okay, that sounds good. You know, how fast is my data rate? But where am I at? What technology am I using? And within that technology, what category of equipment am I using? Who else is on the network? You can be, if you come up with these metrics, they will be inaccurate. It will probably cause customer confusion for one, but worse, it could be misleading to the consumer. So what's the best bet? The best bet is not technical solution. The best bet is an economic solution. And I understand the need for some to make sure that there's a free and open access. I understand that and appreciate that. But it's not something that can be technically regulated. This has to be created by having a competitive environment. For instance, 92% of Americans are served by 3 or more mobile users, but only 15% for wireline systems. And because of the competitive nature of wireless, it should be regulated differently. Let the free market. Product differentiation is key. I know the current thinking in the wireless or within the internet community is that it is a channel. All bits are created equal in the eyes of their maker. But there may be in the future, and keep an open mind about this, there may be reasons why wireless network providers will want to become more specialized. One wireless service provider might be known as the music service provider because they provide exceptionally high quality music. Another one might be advertise themselves as the best in voice. Now they will all provide data. It's just that they may change the way that they do the management of this for marketing purposes and for the ability to appeal to customers' specific needs. So keep an open mind. All right, that's all I had.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. Our next speaker is no stranger to Washington, D.C. It is Michael Katz. He's the Sarin Professor, Strategy and Leadership, and Director of the Institute for Business Innovation at the University of California, Berkeley, where he holds appointments both in the Economics Department and the Haas School of Business. He also served 2 years as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Economic Analysis in the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, as well as 2 years as the Chief Economist of the FCC. Michael.
Is it okay if I
Of course.
come here?
As you will.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say one thing as an economic theorist, because Christopher was pushing data-driven policy making. I'm also in favor of logic-based policy making, which we don't often see. So I will try and shed some light on that. So, the question of the session is, should wireless technologies be regulated differently? Being an academic, I'll tell you the answer is, it depends. Right? Because it depends on how wireline technologies are regulated. And those of you who know me know that my view is actually you probably should have the same regulation for wireless and wireline because you shouldn't have net neutrality regulation for either. Okay. So I will say a little bit about that. But what I will also say at the end, although very little because it's echoing what you've already heard today and something with which I agree, is that the issues, the concerns with net neutrality and the possibility of it doing more damage than good, I think that's heightened for wireless technology. So I do think that there's a stronger case against net neutrality regulation in the case of wireless technologies than wireline, but I want to talk a little bit about the general issue. I should also be very clear that I'm speaking for myself today. As some of you know, I've consulted for companies on the issue of, particularly for mobile wireless providers, on the issue of network neutrality. I've also consulted for companies very much in favor of network neutrality. I'm not speaking for any of them today. Okay, so first thing just to note, the network neutrality means different things to different people. I guess in Washington, it tends to mean whatever the current FCC order is, or what's being contemplated. But if you step back from it and look over the longer term and things jump around and put it in economic terms, there's a bunch of different conceptions. So one would be that says, well, network neutrality means you can't have two-sided pricing, meaning you can't, conception says you can't allow last-mile internet access providers to charge applications providers. They can only charge the household, I'll call them households, they could of course be businesses, the household side of the market. A second conception would be what economists would call second-degree price discrimination, which you can think of as a provider would not be allowed to offer different grades of service. You might think of that as actually pricing based on the characteristics of the bit stream. And I do mean the bit stream. When I was at the FCC as chief economist, I wanted to have a T-shirt that said, "A bit is a piece of," but for various reasons, I was not allowed to say it. The fear of the Media Bureau censoring me was not one of them. But what I mean by that is maybe that a bit is a bit, but as I think what Jeff was saying, it's not true that a bit stream is a bit stream, and different applications have very different requirements for what sort of bit stream and what characteristics allow that application to be provided successfully. But in any case, second-degree price discrimination would, so-called, and gotta be careful about calling it discrimination, would allow multiple grades of service, and of course then there's the issue as well, can you offer those multiple grades of service to the households, and can you offer to the app providers? And as you know, there's now a distinction between those. A third conception would be that there's no third-degree price discrimination, which is to say pricing based specifically on the application. And that, I think, you see, does start to become more worrisome from the point of view of economists to say, well, why is it specifically about a particular application as opposed to the characteristics of the underlying bit stream? I should also point out, though, however, that if an application has particular enough requirements for what sort of stream it needs in order to be successfully provided, the difference between the two types of, between second degree and third degree starts to blur. I mean, it's similar if you think about it. If you had a company that says, look, we don't engage in sex discrimination, we just have a rule that anybody who can get pregnant has to be fired. It wouldn't matter if it's a man or a woman. Okay, so you do have to be careful. If you get clever enough about these things, they start to blur. And then the final one, and I guess the one that would put the strictest standard for the regulation for when it would come into place, or one might think of as the weakest notion of network neutrality, would be some sort of no vertical foreclosure standard that's saying that a platform, an integrated platform, has to carry competing applications on an equivalent basis, or moving more to an antitrust approach, at least has to show that it wasn't going out of its way to stop the competing applications. Now recently, I think the focus, if you think about this continuum I put out there, would be on paid prioritization or fast lanes or differentiated arrangements, which is some combination, I think, of people saying, well, you shouldn't have two-sided pricing, right? You shouldn't let the applications pay or make them pay. And then also this limit on having different degrees of service, different qualities of service available for purchase by the app provider. So let me talk a little bit about that. It seems to me that this concern with fast lanes and with paid prioritization, whatever, basically is my leading candidate for being the Robinson-Patman Act of the 21st century, by which I mean an act that at one level is claimed to protect competition, but really is doing the opposite. There's this truism in antitrust, and it is true, but it's also a hideous cliche, about the difference between protecting competition and protecting competitors, and that the concern of public policy should be with protecting competition. I certainly subscribe to that view, and I think that a lot of the advocates of banning paid prioritization and banning differentiated arrangements are really committing that error. Or more to the point, a lot of them are not committing any error at all. They know full well that what they're doing is they're protecting themselves, even if it's not good for competition. Okay, and so, think about it. If you think about in other markets, if you have a bunch of firms that are competing, and some of them decide to buy higher quality inputs in order to offer a better product to consumers, you think of that as a good thing. And in fact, right, if the firms in an industry got together and said, well, let's agree that no one's going to try to buy better inputs than the other, that would just be wasteful. All that's going to do is help consumers, right? You'd be able to bring an antitrust case against them. But here what we're saying is, well, no, we don't want we're saying exactly that. We don't want application providers or edge providers to compete by trying to purchase better inputs, where here the input is the last mile access to their customers. Okay? So a couple of facts. I'll say they're facts, they are facts. One is that, as a general matter, paying for improved service is not discrimination, right? If somebody buys a higher quality service and pays more for it, the person buying the cheaper service, the lower quality service but lower price, is not necessarily getting discriminated against, right? We would see that in other industries. I use BMW because I no longer own a car, so I don't actually know which models are considered better than others, but I know that BMW's marketing people lack creativity and have had those numbers forever. Okay, so 7 is supposed to be better than a 3. They actually went through this because it used to be the 6 was more expensive than the 7, and that caused no end of trouble, so they renumbered it. That's the 8, I think. Anyway, the fact that BMW is selling 7 Series, right, for a lot of money doesn't imply, they're high quality, doesn't imply they're discriminating against buyers of 3 Series, right? You wouldn't go in and say, well, this is outrageous. There's some people allowed to drive 7 Series, and other people are relegated to 3s, okay? But that's exactly what we're talking about with net neutrality. Similarly, another fact is that different applications place different demands on the distribution networks. Jeff talked about that. Okay, so variety is valuable. So it's the same thing in the auto industry. It would not be a sensible regulation to say, well, we don't want some people literally driving in the fast lane and others not, so there can only be one model of car and everybody has to buy it. Okay. Now, you might think, well, that's fine, you're saying cars, but they're not an input to vital industry. All the arguments would be the same thing as trucks, right? It would be crazy to have a rule that says, we can't have trucking fast lanes. Everybody has to buy the same truck, and no business is allowed to buy a better truck than another one because that would give them an unfair advantage. Okay. All right, so as you can see, I'm not, not a big fan of this, but I do want to say that there are other arguments that can be made about whether fast lanes are good. And in fact, we have this debate because one of the questions that comes up is said, well, if you allow fast lanes, what's happening in the slow lane? Okay? And the view I put forth, in a sense, is saying, I'll caricature my own view, it says, well, all right, the slow lane just stayed the same, and now we added a fast lane as an option. Well, who can be against that? Well, the people competing against the companies that choose to take advantage of the fast lane can be against it, but that's obviously a pretty self-serving argument. Okay, and so that would say, well, wait a minute, all this stuff with net neutrality is, is somewhere between silly and destructive. Okay, but the concern that a more serious advocate of net neutrality would bring up and say, well, look, it's not just that the higher quality service is being offered, it's that creates incentives to degrade the low end in order to better sort people and to push people to buying the more expensive thing. Okay, and there are situations that can happen. There's also debates about whether this sort of pricing, what it does to applications providers' investment incentives. And there's debate in different models about what happens to the network providers' investment incentives, depending on whether or not you allow differentiated arrangements. And so the question is, well, what does economics tell us about these subsidiary questions? Well, I think the one thing that serious economists can agree on, who work on these issues, is that there exist models in which network neutrality is harmful, and there are models in which it's beneficial. Okay, you can write down a rigorous and consistent model in which certain forms of network neutrality do make things better. That's certainly the case. It's also quite simple to write down where it makes it worse. And unfortunately, it's extremely difficult to find data that's going to let you distinguish between the situations. These models depend very much on the specific way the congestion occurs and the technology is represented in the model. And I think we're going to be hard-pressed to come up with the answer for is network neutrality good or bad by looking at these sorts of models or even these models calibrated against data. So what to do about the ambiguity? Well, I think we do have a tried and true approach to these issues, and that is basically the antitrust approach. Seems to me it makes a lot more sense to go to a case-by-case analysis based on a rule of reason approach. Now, one thing to note on that, though, there's an issue which I'll just mention and then move on, is about who should be doing that. I think the answer is the antitrust agencies as opposed to the commission. And one of the reasons for that is I think we should be taking this on under broad antitrust law because we have a long history of decisions on which to build. There's a danger or a problem with moving to a case-by-case analysis. If you have no history of the decisions and how the rules apply, no one's quite sure what's going to happen. Okay? Whereas in antitrust, fortunately, there's a lot one can build. Economy-wide antitrust, there's a lot one can build on. Another thing we get out of the antitrust approach, though, is what I said before, you look for harm to competition, not harm to competitors. They're very different things. And where that would lead you, I think, is really a focus on vertical foreclosure, okay? And the use of things like exclusive contracts specifically to weaken particular competitors. So it would be a much more targeted looking for trouble. Okay, so lastly, let me touch on the subject for today very briefly, and that's what's different about wireless. And again, to reiterate what you've already heard, there's the point that you have competition among various wireless providers, which means both that there's less of an upside from intervention, because there's a much higher probability that competition is going to drive the market to good outcomes. And there's also more of a downside, that you can distort competition, that you can break what was otherwise functioning well, and then actually you're more likely to do that because it's just a more complicated situation. As Jeffrey was mentioning, you can have firms pursuing these differentiated multidimensional strategies, and you can never be sure how you're upsetting those with various rules. Second thing is that network management, and also I will add revenue model innovation, are especially important for wireless networks given the constraints they face, as the spectrum limitations. And then thirdly, and related to the second, is that the demand for investments, and the value of investment in this industry is extremely high. And that means that messing up the investment incentives is really bad news. And as I mentioned, there certainly are models, and you can debate it, but there is, I think, a very real threat of distorting investment incentives and weakening them. So lastly, let me just close by mentioning a couple other industries and thinking what network neutrality, or at least this no differentiated arrangements and no two-sided pricing would mean. I mean, you could imagine having a slogan. This is for the older people in the room who know what newspapers are. Okay. You could imagine in the olden days anyway, someone could have said, well, we have to have newspaper neutrality. And they don't mean that, no, they can't endorse candidates in the election, but if you take network neutrality and you applied it to newspapers, you would have said, oh, look, they're already charging their subscribers. Why, you can't possibly let them charge advertisers too. That would be double dipping. Moreover, it'd be really unfair, because what about the little business that can't afford a big ad? Okay, Macy's is going to have some huge ad, and the mom and pop little clothing store won't have a chance. So newspaper neutrality would have said that you can't charge for ads, and that all the ads have to be the same size. And I guess you'd randomly allocate them. And I think most people would agree that that would have been pretty silly, but as I say, it's not very much different than what some people advocate for net neutrality. And similarly, you could say that about Google. You should say they shouldn't be allowed to have ads, or certainly they shouldn't be allowed to charge for them. Now you say, well, wait a minute, that's not fair to say that about Google, because they're not charging the users for the searches. Oh my God, Google's doubly bad. Not only are they charging for ads, but they're zero rating search. We need to stop this immediately. So I think, I will just end with this. It's easy to, and I'm sure someone who's as clever as I, if there were such a person on the other side, could think of things, to make fun of my position. I could make fun of myself, I deserve it. But could make fun of my position too. But I think there is actually some seriousness to these examples, that if you think about them, the logic really is very similar. And I think it would be very misguided in those other circumstances to apply that logic, and that should tell us something. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Our third speaker is Daniel Lyons. Daniel Lyons is an associate professor of law at Boston College, a graduate of both Harvard College and Harvard Law School, clerk for Judge Cynthia Holcomb Hall in the Ninth Circuit, and practiced law at Munger, Tolles, and Olson before entering the academy. Daniel.
Thank you. If we pass it over, then I can control the slides while I'm talking.
It's still on the end of Jeff's presentation. There
All
we
right,
go.
great. All right. So I want to start my remarks today by taking an overview of what the FCC has actually said about wireless net neutrality and why, because I think that's a good framework for figuring out whether what they said in the past continues to hold water. Thanks. So in 2010, right, the FCC adopted their first net neutrality rules, and the rules that governed wireline were fairly substantial. As the idea was that wireline providers had to subscribe to this transparency requirement. Whatever it is they were doing with traffic management, they had to openly disclose that to their customers. They were prohibited from blocking any lawful internet content, and they were prohibited from engaging in what the agency called unreasonable discrimination. What did that mean? We weren't really sure, but whatever it was really important, and it applied to all wireline people, right? But they made a distinction up front to say that they were going to apply a much lighter touch to wireless networks. The same transparency rule more or less applied, but the blocking requirement was much less stringent, right? The FCC said they were going to require wireless providers to make sure they weren't going to block apps that competed with the carrier's own voice or video telephony services. And they said that because mobile web browsing was sufficiently mature, they were going to adopt a rule that prohibited blocking of websites. But notably, right, the blocking rule did not go beyond that, and the wireless ecosystem was not subject to the same unreasonable discrimination rule that wireline was. All right, so fast forward to 2014, the notice of proposed rulemaking today that's currently under deliberation, the FCC has tentatively concluded that it wants to maintain the same approach, although it's asked for comments about whether or not we ought to extend that blocking limit and whether to apply its new commercial reasonableness test to wireless networks as well as wireline networks. Now, one interesting thing that comes out of taking a look back at both 2010 and the 2014 proposed rule is that both are highlighting Title III as a source of authority to impose net neutrality rules on wireless networks, right? So Title III gives the FCC fairly significant authority to place restrictions on spectrum use if those restrictions are in the agency's public interest. And the DC Circuit clarified in the recent data roaming order that that's a pretty broad power. So those of us in 2010 that were fairly skeptical of the FCC's sort of triple bank shot theory of Section 706 jurisdiction over wireline sort of appreciated the fact that the Commission's authority was strongest in the area where it was enacting the least restrictive rules, right? Because Title III was actually fairly robust source of jurisdiction for the lighter touch rules that they were applying onto wireless. Now, Chairman Wheeler has engaged in a series of public discussions lately that suggest that he might be reconsidering the light touch wireless rules. But I think, along with the other panelists today, right, I think it would be a mistake to simply take rules that were designed for wireline and dump them onto a completely different market and a completely different network architecture. The 2010 rules found that wireless networks were different for three basic reasons. And all three reasons I think are valid today, right? The wireless ecosystem is dynamic in a less mature marketplace. It's subject to greater competition than wireline. And it's subject to unique capacity constraints that make network management different than wireline. So on the issue of dynamism, right, we have seen since 2010, I don't have to tell you, right, explosive growth in smartphones, series of current and projected dedicated mobile devices, right, the oft-promised Internet of Things that is lurking just over the horizon, and the hundreds of thousands of apps that are supporting countless jobs that the FCC likes to cite ad nauseum about the importance of the app economy going forward. Now, as Chairman Wheeler has noted, right, the number of LTE users has grown significantly from 2010. In 2010, I think we were at about 200,000 LTE users. Today, we're at about 120 million. But I don't think that's a reason, per se, to say we ought to adopt more stringent regulation of this area now. Rather, I think it's quite the opposite. I think it demonstrates that it's a testament to success of the light touch regulation framework, right? LTE adoption is a result of tens of billions of dollars of investment that were invested in part based on this promise of a less regulated environment. And more importantly, right, the market is showing no signs of slowing to maturity. Sandvine estimates that median mobile data use has grown 20% in the last 6 months alone, from 84 megabytes per month to 106. And the market is significantly differentiated, right? So you look at heavy users and light users, there's a huge bifurcation. The top 1% of users, says Sandvine, are responsible for 19% of upstream and 12% of downstream traffic, while the bottom half of users collectively, right, make up less than 10% of total network traffic. So the market continues to be dynamic. It's also, I think, subject to significant competition. The great knock that is always cited on wireline providers, the reason we need net neutrality in wireline is that this grand duopoly argument, right? Most consumers have at most two choices for wireline. It's either the old phone company or the old cable company. So we can debate, I think, whether that duopoly assumption is valid, right? Are there other substitutes out there that are at least doing some work? If so, if the duopoly assumption is valid, is it likely that duopoly is going to trend toward competition or cooperation? I think that's also open to question. But for today's purposes, right, it's important to note that the duopoly assumption doesn't apply in wireline, right? Or in wireless. Wireless is different. Most of us have 4 national wireless carriers to choose from, plus regional and niche players that are out there. And they're actually competing, right? It's not just that they're out there and there could be subject to competition. There's actual evidence of competition. The market is moving toward no contract models for wireless service. The rise of offers to pay the early termination fee of your current provider in order to lure you away, I think financially probably crazy, but evidence of how far companies are willing to go in order to lure consumers away one from another. It shows that customers are demanding the ability to switch easily, and firms are responding to that demand and sacrificing margin in order to do so. And in this kind of hyper-competitive environment, right, there's less need, I think, for regulatory oversight to monitor potentially consumer harmful practices, because a lot of them will become self-correcting. Customers who don't like the network management practices of the current provider will simply switch. And they have multiple opportunities to do so, and competitors are greasing the wheels to make it easier for them to do so. And then finally, as Professor Reed indicated, right, wireless is subject to unique capacity constraints. Spectrum is limited. You can't simply lay more cable to alleviate congestion. You need to actively manage your network traffic and adjust for interference. And traffic patterns are less predictable on wireless networks than they are on wireline. Right, if you look at peaks and valleys in wireline, it's fairly consistent. You come home and the traffic spikes right about 6 p.m. and it stays up until about 10 p.m. because everybody's streaming Netflix after they get home from work, right? Whereas if you look at wireless traffic, it's like this all day. And so it's much less predictable, and therefore it means you have to be much more active in managing your traffic load. And so all these things suggest a need for greater flexibility on behalf of wireless providers in order to be able to manage their traffic subject to their capacity constraints. So all of these reasons that the FCC initially cited in 2010 for why we should have a lighter touch, I think, are at least equally valid now, if not more so. But I want to step back and say it more fundamentally. Right? What is the problem with taking this sort of wireline vision of net neutrality and applying it to wireless? I think more fundamentally, this rigid, homogenized broadband product that's envisioned by net neutrality advocates is increasingly at odds with the way that wireless markets are evolving. And we see that especially internationally. So with few exceptions, right, the goal of net neutrality says that providers generally should provide access to all points on the internet or none at all, and you have to do so on relatively equal terms. And so this presumes some notion that what consumers want and what consumers need, right, is equal access to everything from every device at all times. This is what Professor Hughes referred to as the myth of the one screen. And in many international markets, carrier behavior and consumer response is illustrating the fallacy of that myth. So for example, numerous carriers internationally are offering Voice Plus functionality, right? Which is going to give consumers talk, text, and access to a limited amount of internet content, but not the full internet. And a popular version of this is the social media plan. So in 2010, Turkcell in Turkey, right, offers a free Facebook promotion. The idea was anybody with a cell phone can get a stripped down text-only version of Facebook for free on their phones for 6 months. And in 2012, the company launched a similar Twitter Zero campaign. They gave you free access to Twitter. At the end of the promotional period, in both campaigns, the company replaced this free stripped-down version with a paid package where you could take your existing voice, your talk and text plan, and you could strap on access to Facebook or Twitter for 5 more Turkish lira a month. I don't really know how much that is, but I imagine it's not as much as full internet access on Turkcell. Now, business types, right, would describe this pretty clearly as a classic niche strategy, right? You're targeting consumers that are interested in paying for some mobile content, but who are unwilling or unable to spend the premium for the full bells and whistles of a traditional access everything at all times plan. And Turkcell's management was explaining that part of the goal of the plan, right, was to get some technophobes who have their traditional flip phones more comfortable with the idea of consuming mobile data. If we lower the price on it, maybe they'll taste it, they'll sample it, they'll get used to the idea of mobile data, they'll think they like it, and then eventually we can migrate them to more comprehensive plans. And according to the company, it worked. Right? Turkcell saw an 80% increase in mobile Facebook use and a 340% increase in mobile Twitter use following these campaigns. They sold 600,000 of these social media strap-on plans in their first year, and the average revenue per consumer was up 9%. And Facebook wants you to know that Turkcell is not alone. They reached similar deals with companies in 14 different countries by 2013. And Twitter-based deals are popular as well. Now, a number of other wireless companies are engaging in what I might call cross-promotional deals or marketing agreements, partnerships that bundle wireless service with some kind of edge service in order to gain an edge, pardon the pun, on the competition, right? So in Canada, TELUS partnered with Microsoft in order to launch what it called the Skype phone. This is a plan where if you had the Skype plan, you would have unlimited Skype-to-Skype voice calls, and you'd have the opportunity to purchase Skype credit through your phone and simply have it rolled into your monthly wireless phone bill rather than having to pay a separate account to Skype. And this was a win-win for Microsoft and for TELUS. For Skype, right, it meant that it could differentiate itself from other VoIP providers because you could fund your Skype VoIP service through your existing wireless plan. And for TELUS, they could differentiate themselves from other wireless providers by offering consumers something that you can't get from your other wireless plans, right? Integrated Skype technology in a way that's integrated more than it was if you were on Rogers or Bell. So TELUS was leveraging, to an extent, right, their experience with billing and back office operations so that Microsoft wouldn't have to. And then a somewhat different twist, Orange Telecom, which is a European wireless provider, includes in its UK wireless plans the opportunity for customers who subscribe to sign up for 2 subscription-based services free. In addition to your wireless talk, text, data plan, you get two services that you would otherwise have to pay a monthly subscription for, and you choose from a menu that includes Sky Sports TV, the Deezer music service, or the London Times online newspaper. And again, this is a way for Orange to try to differentiate itself, right, by offering its customers something other than just mobile broadband by itself. Now, we're starting to see similar innovations here in the United States, particularly following the 2014 decision that brought down the old net neutrality rules. So T-Mobile recently launched a plan that includes unlimited streaming from select internet-based audio services like Pandora and iHeartRadio. And the idea, right, is to target, again, this niche strategy, right? We're going to target music-savvy customers in the same way that Orange does by bundling an over-the-top edge service with our wireless product. Sprint has announced that it would like to soon start marketing a social media plan similar to what Turkcell offered, right? So you would get talk and text and a limited suite of broadband services like access to Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or Pinterest, but not full internet access. And the price point would be much lower than they charge for their full mobile internet plan. And it's not just traditional carriers that are getting involved either. Right? Syntonic Wireless is a company in Seattle that's focused on finding innovative new ways to deliver mobile content to consumers. They made news earlier this year when they launched Freeway, which was the idea would be a one-stop shop for AT&T customers to access sponsored data. Right? Whoever's cut a deal with AT&T to offer sponsored data, information you can consume without it counting against your monthly data limit. It would all be available on the Freeway application, so you'd have a menu of all your free options. In addition, last month, Syntonic launched on-ramp education services. And this was a specialized program targeted at school districts. that would allow the district would be distributing Google Chromebooks that had embedded 4G radios in it that could reach selected district-approved online content and applications. So when you're in a district where internet adoption was fairly low, these schools could hand out these laptops to the students, and the students could take them home in order to have mobile access or broadband access to do their homework, but without using school equipment in order to surf YouTube or whatever it is that the school didn't want the students using their equipment for. So these are unquestionably, I think, pro-consumer initiatives. They give consumers the content that they want, and they help lower the cost of getting people online, so they help narrow the digital divide. But they likely run afoul of net neutrality principles, even the light touch principles that have been proposed for wireless. So Chile, which famously enacted the world's first binding net neutrality rules in 2010, recently prohibited social media plans and other plans that offered anything less than full internet access. The Facebook-only plan like the one that Turkcell had was very popular in Chile, right up until Subtel, the regulator, came down and said, this is a violation of net neutrality and you can't offer it. And they're now facing a significant uproar, not only from consumers who really liked having the option of getting a Facebook attached to their voice plans without having to pay for the entire internet, but also companies like Wikipedia that wanted to make their stuff available for free, even to people who don't have a broad data plan otherwise. And of course, famously, when Metro PCS offered a plan in 2010, right, this gave you talk, text, web browsing, and the ability to access certain video clips on YouTube, right, they faced a firestorm from net neutrality advocates because allowing YouTube to stream over your network and not other video providers was considered discriminatory against video providers other than YouTube, despite the fact that the company literally could not stream any other content over its limited networks. And the net neutrality rules weren't even binding on Metro PCS at the time. Right, so because of the controversy over the plan, Metro PCS ultimately had to withdraw the plan, which I think was a downside to those who would have loved to have this $40 a month plan for some internet connectivity rather than buying an unlimited plan from Verizon or AT&T for perhaps 3 times more. Ultimately, right, I think the one-size-fits-all model of net neutral internet access does not map well onto an increasingly diverse customer base. And I think it's particularly true in the wireless sector where we're seeing all of these different innovations going on. And that, I think, is what we've lost track of in this debate. And so back in 2005, when the Internet Policy Statement first was adopted, the focus was squarely on the consumer, right? The FCC said the consumer is entitled to content, applications, devices of their choice, and competition. But at some point in the policy debate, we've shifted our focus away from consumers. And now we're focused on protecting content and application providers. And I think it's important to shift that back, or at least to bring the consumer voice back into debate. Whatever rules the Commission winds up enacting, I think they should allow the flexibility to test these new wireless models, in addition to allowing innovation among content and application providers. Ultimately, I think it's important that the Commission support innovation that enhances the consumer's ability to access the internet-based services that they desire, wherever that innovation occurs within the internet ecosystem.
Well, thank you, Dave. Well, before we open this floor to questions, I want to throw one brief question at each of our panelists. So, starting with you, Michael. Michael, you suggested there's different ways a provider could discriminate, and that the ideal one is not to do it at the application level. It's the bit stream that matters. If a different application has the same characteristics, why wouldn't it be treated the same? So I flew out here from San Francisco recently on United, and they now are offering Wi-Fi on the plane, and this applies to any of us who do Amtrak as well. They block video. Is that problematic? I mean, it's application specific, not bitstream specific. Why, and for your view, on your model, that's what they shouldn't do. Should we be troubled by that?
Well, actually, let me say a couple of things. I'm just saying I'm more concerned when it starts to be application specific, because even there, though, there could be reasons for doing it. Although it does sound like what you're saying. First off, you're lucky you were one of the few United flights that has Wi-Fi, because let me just say, United really sucks. And I can say that as someone who's flown over 2 million miles on it. Regrets most of those miles. Anyway, but what they're concerned with, presumably, though, is congestion on the system, and then you'd think what they would do is just try to, some other way, limit your usage and not say, oh, we care whether it's particularly video versus something else. So, I don't know. They're under particularly strong constraints there, and they may also be particularly bad at network management and doing it. But it is a situation where I would have thought a carrier would be more concerned with the overall strain on its system as opposed to trying to pick out a particular type of application.
So the question for Jeff. Since 2010, the wireless world was simpler. Now we're seeing Wi-Fi hotspots proliferate and cell phones set up to migrate from a cellular network onto a Wi-Fi network. We talked briefly before, small cells, they're selling them to your home to extend your network. How does and most of your presentations focus on this traditional cellular network, single management. We're going to a world where we're going to have a much more diverse network where people are running their own Wi-Fi spots using different management systems. How does that change the analysis from a policy standpoint?
The trend is for LTE to become more Wi-Fi-like and Wi-Fi to become more LTE-like. If you look at the way that the standards are developing, LTE unlicensed is an example where you can have your own private network, and then Wi-Fi is learning from the cellular industry that you have to manage things given a limited amount of spectrum. I think it's just too early to say how that's going to shake out. I think it's something that is worth looking to, but at this point, given the dynamic nature of it, I would leave it alone and see how things progress.
And the question for Daniel, although I know Jeff and to some extent Michael touched on this as well. One of the sets of proposals that are coming around DC right now are what we think of as hybrid proposals, or what are often called hybrid proposals. One pushed by Mozilla, we should regulate as Title II with respect to edge providers, but not with respect to end users. Or Henry Waxman's proposal that we have Title I unless the courts strike it down, and then we get Title II. What do you make of these hybrid proposals? Are they an improvement? Do they raise the same concerns? How would you react?
No, I don't think they're an improvement at all. I think they're increase the level of complexity and the level of uncertainty. And normally in the law, when you're increasing the level of uncertainty, that is a proxy for increasing the level of litigiousness, right? One thing I think most of the industry has been pretty uniform on is we need to know what the rules of the road are going to be, right? We'd all prefer one model or the other, but what we actually really need is some certainty. So that we all know what the rules of the road are going to be, and so we can understand what the assumptions are going to be going into our investment models going forward. I think these hybrid models, to the extent that they create some ambiguity about where Title I ends and Title II starts, or what services are going to be subject to which rule, right, only puts off the day that we'll finally have a definitive answer and can move forward.
And it occurs to me, Michael, in your comments about thinking about edge and the innovation there and two-sided markets, would you think it makes sense to regulate the edge-facing connections from a last-mile provider, but not regulate the end-user-facing the connections?
No, again, I don't think it should be doing the regulation there. I mean, I do think it can raise potentially different issues because some of the competitive issues are different, but again, are different. But I think that taking an antitrust approach and largely relying on economy-wide antitrust would deal with those issues.
Yeah, that's very helpful. There are questions already. Ben, if you would, Hal has a question here, and if you would identify yourself when you ask the questions, I would appreciate it. Thanks. If nothing else, for the audience at home.
Sure. Hal Singer, PPI and Economist, Inc. I have a quick comment for something that Michael said, and then a question that I'd just like to put to the panel. I think Michael said that we have a lack of experience with case by case, and that would be an argument for having these disputes adjudicated maybe by an antitrust court or by the DOJ. And it's funny, I don't know if you watched the economics debate, but Jonathan Baker used the same argument against me to advocate a per se prohibition. He said that there'd be too much uncertainty under a case-by-case regime. And because the actors needed to know what the rules were, they'd be basically frozen in place. And I came back with the notion that one, as these cases unfold, we'll learn how the rules of the road will look. And two, there actually is an experience of adjudicating discrimination at the FCC. It's done in the video space. There's been about 5 or 6 cases there. I just wanted to let you know that was ironic. But here's the the question I put to the panel. If the FCC were to embrace a light touch approach in which they flip the presumption around, which I think the DC Circuit was suggesting they do, that is, priority would be presumptively legal and efficient, and it would be the burden of the content provider to prove otherwise. Right? And by the way, that's exactly what's going on in the video disputes. Disparate treatment, disparate carriage is presumptively okay, legal, and the burden is on the independent cable network to prove that it was done for discriminatory reasons. So imagine the FCC actually embraced this kind of light touch approach. They flip the presumption around. And you have 2 complaints that kind of move along at the same time, one against a wireless provider and one against a wireline. Why couldn't we go with the same framework and just allow the wireless provider to say, hey, the reason why their speeds may have fallen or may have gotten different treatment was for reasons unrelated to discrimination, but because of congestion on the network. What I'm trying to go at is, if you got the framework right, you could address, or maybe not, all of these attributes that you're citing, capacity, competition, as factors that would be considered in a complaint-driven process. Thanks.
So I agree that that's right, that if what you're setting up is a process that takes a case-by-case approach and it has enough of a history that people have a sense of how it's going to play out, then you can have a lot of factors. I mean, that's why we have economy-wide antitrust laws, right? We have, I get it wrong, but some of them are celebrating their 100th anniversary this year. They apply to incredibly wide range of industries, and they've proven to be very durable, but I think precisely because they set up a process that's very fact-specific, and generally, it puts the burden on the plaintiff to show that there's really been harm to competition. So yes, if you had an approach like that, I think then you could apply it to wireless and wireline. So this is so all economists in the end think alike, because it's sort of like the joke I made at the beginning, which is, no, you could treat them the same as long as you treat them both correctly.
Well, in a way, that question, I guess, Jeff, addresses most directly your remarks, which is you endorse a different set of rules for wireless. And I guess the question suggests, if we had a good set of rules where the presumption is that the practices are legal until it's shown to be harmful, would that be enough to address the concerns that you raised in your presentation?
My concern is that people will start comparing wireless services. That, I'm getting my Netflix great with AT&T, and it's not with T-Mobile. Does AT&T have a special deal going on with Netflix? There's so many things that enter into that equation that the consumer would not be able to know. It depends upon the technology that is being used by the service providers in the handset. It depends on the position of the base station. It depends on the way that they tilt the antenna. There's just so many potential differences. It would be like comparing apples and oranges. So I worry about getting bogged down in a legal quagmire. You see a lot of lawsuits based upon discrimination, and really it's just the physics of the problem.
Another question in the back, and then here.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Jalogad. I own a tech boutique law firm, but more recently I've been a polytech blogger. A couple of years ago, one of the big arguments for a light touch and against regulating wireless was spectrum scarcity and spectrum inefficiency, that sort of issues. I didn't hear much about that today. Is that something that we're moving away from? Is that an argument that's less, enforceable argument, or is it just not an issue any longer? Are we dealing with the tech issue, the technological limitations, or?
Shall I?
Please.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good one. For the economist here, they've heard of tragedy of the commons. If you have a resource that has no cost associated to you, it will get abused. And as an example, there's different ways to do video. There's a good way to do video. There's a better way to do it, a video, and a best way to do video. And if it's no cost to you as the video provider, well, why should I spend the extra money on a compression algorithm and all the equipment associated with it? I'll just use the service provider's bandwidth. There has to be some accountability here for spectrum efficiency, because it is a precious resource. It's a natural resource that we have to be very careful with.
Well, and to offer an unanswer, one, we are using spectrum more efficiently than ever. So we are mining that spectrum constantly. Second, we are able to use more and more bands more effectively. That's the good news. We're now talking about adding a Wi-Fi band or expanding the Wi-Fi band in the 5 gigahertz range, which people didn't traditionally think of. We've heard about the AWS auction, the incentive auctions. We're redeploying more and more. That's the good news. The bad news is what was discussed here earlier, is usage is going through the roof. And we're in a race where whether it ultimately ends up, the scarcity problems that are being worse or better depends a great deal on how fast our technical improvements outpace or don't outpace the growth in the rates of the consumption. And so that is unpredictable. But that is one of the persistence problems we have in deciding whether or not this is going to be scarce. Now, something that Professor Reed has really emphasized is the need to conserve bandwidth, and one of the things that hasn't been talked about is a lot of the proposals are talking about zero price interconnection or different, not ensuring that certain people don't pay prices. Prices serve a lot of purposes, but one of which is to give incentives to conserve on the use of bandwidth. And if you have, one of the interesting problems we had, as identified by the Open Internet Advisory Committee, is the Apple FaceTime dispute, which was AT&T was not treating FaceTime, this app, well, it's not clear it's an application, it's a feature of their operating system, and whether you call it an app or not is a whole different question. But anyway, we'll call it an app for today. A single user, according to a study done by a Princeton engineering professor, would use 1/2 to 1/3 of the uplink bandwidth on a single node. It just wasn't engineered to be efficient. And without a price signal, they really didn't have any incentive to do so. They just simply deployed the technology. And so there's prices serve a wide variety of purposes in this place, creating incentives, rewards for investment and the like, but and others as well.
Go ahead.
I would just add one thing to that, though, that I completely agree with this point about it's important to create price incentives, because the overall efficiency of these networks is going to be not just the network provider's decision, but also the app design. But to say on that, though, that you could stay away from some of the net neutrality issues there, because if you had usage-based pricing levied on the end user, that at least creates an incentive. If the end users then know which applications, in fact, chew up a lot of bandwidth and are costly for them. It's actually, I think, is going to, in the future, we're going to see an interesting set of questions about transparency if we do start seeing more usage-based pricing, and then the carriers start saying, okay, well, we need to have transparency, so we're going to need to start telling users, guess what, when you go on, you're doing mobile Netflix or something, it's using up huge amounts, and then there are going to be all these fights about whether they're calculating it right, and whether they should say it. But I think it also raises a more general issue that if you're going to talk about transparency, you should talk about the whole ecosystem and not just talk about transparency for the carriers.
Yeah, I think you're right that the movement toward usage-based pricing is going to increase consumer awareness of how much, and we saw also with the development of the App Store, right? So when people started getting iPads and iPhones, they became aware of what 16 gigs and 32 gigs and 64 gigs really meant, because that was the limited space they had on their unit. And as a result, in the App Store, right, they started disclosing the size of every app that you're downloading. Once that information became relevant to the consumer started demanding it, and it became something not only they understood, but that companies were disclosing. And I think as we move toward a usage-based price system, either on wireline or, as is already in place, on wireless, you'll begin to see that information come out as well.
And the hard thing is, apparently I saw a study once that half as much of your wireless bandwidth is updates in the background, not apps you're actually running. And so it's very hard to figure out what this would mean. Question here.
I want to jump back to the previous.
Can you identify yourself first?
Yeah, Chris Gutman-McCabe with CTIA. I want to jump back to the previous question about the idea of having one set of rules that are interpreted differently. So we have a lawyer, an economist, and an engineer. I imagine there's a joke somewhere in here, but I'll leave the joke for another point in time. So from each of your perspectives, so imagine we have a single set of rules that are interpreted different. Imagine if it's a technical issue, Dr. Reed, and all of a sudden it's placed in front of the FCC, and a wireless carrier has to defend its practices, or Michael, imagine it's a business differentiation, a service differentiation. Are the three of you concerned? I mean, are you concerned that the FCC, tethered to the Administrative Procedure Act, is going to have to review, business or technical practices of carriers that are moving at light speed, and decisions to differentiate? I mean, we have a DOJ and an FCC that very much seem to want 4 nationwide competitors, and yet I have to say I'm concerned that they might not be allowed or able to in real time differentiate their products. So, looking at it as a lawyer and the FCC tethered to the APA, is this going to be, if there were one set of rules that were analyzed differently, would that be troubling with a fast-paced wireless, market? And the same, Michael, for you from an economist, and Dr. Reed from an engineering perspective. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the FCC presiding over the same set of rules but interpreted differently.
I think you're right that the pace of change affects the value of precedent, right? So when you have a case that lands in 2012 or 2013 on certain factors that turn on the architecture then, the precedential value of that becomes less if in 2014 or 15 the underlying facts have changed. I'm more concerned, I think, with the notion that if you have one set of rules, then lawyers will be tempted to draw upon wireline precedent in order to justify what they would consider wireless discrimination, right? And so although we have ostensibly under Hal's model, right, one set of rules but applied differently between wireless and wireline, the fact that it's one rule would suggest to a lawyer to look for analogies wherever you can, and then the burden would effectively be shifted to the wireless provider to justify why I'm different than wireline in this instance or that one.
I think if wireless service providers have to go to the FCC and ask for an exemption for wireless in a certain area, I don't think it's going to be feasible because of the amount of detail that they will have to go through. For instance, I put up there a webpage from 3GPP, 140-something pages, which just listed the expected changes in the standard. And they're very detailed changes. I just don't think that the FCC will be able to keep up. It's hard enough for the carriers who just have a lot of resources and a lot of great talent to be able to keep up. And I just don't think the FCC will be able to do it.
Okay, so I guess I'd say what I said before, which is I'm not as concerned about whether it's a single set of rules, it's whether it's the right rules being applied to everyone, and whether it's the right process. And so I would have concern for both wireline and wireless if we're saying that they're constantly having to seek permission to do things. But I do agree it's probably particularly problematic in wireless because I think there's a lot less certainty about well, actually, not so sure. I think wireline's pretty much in turmoil too about what's the right business model and pricing model. So I would be concerned with either wireline or wireless if they're going to have to seek permission rather than have a process that says for most of these things the default is you can do it, and if someone wants to bring a complaint, it's their burden to show harm to competition.
Permissionless innovation was a catchphrase that originated among the net neutrality folks, right, suggesting that content application providers should be able to change whatever they're doing without having to get permission from the carriers. And it's been intriguing me to see the carriers then co-opting that exact same phrase to say, we ought to be able to innovate what we're doing without getting permission from the FCC. What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Anne-Marie, you have a question.
Just going back to I'm Anne Marie Kovacs with the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. And just going back to the earlier question about spectrum coming online and your point about about explosive traffic, I've been looking at Cisco estimates of traffic over the internet, and in 2013, mobile was 2% of traffic. Their projections are that by 2018, it'll be 6% of traffic, and it will be up by a factor of about 8 times. The amount of spectrum that the FCC is planning to bring on board in the 2 unprecedentedly large auctions that we all hope are going to succeed will increase spectrum by 1/3. So spectrum's going up 1/3. Mobile data under current assumptions is going up by a factor of 8, and that's without piling on a huge amount of video because you're changing incentives to make it easy for it to pile on. So I guess the question, as well as just the comment for Jeff, is how much will LTE Advanced or the other things that you can foresee enable the networks to bear?
Oh, that's a good question. And there are some innovations coming down the road, such as carrier aggregation. We're just starting to see a little bit of that. Spectrum sharing, better use of Wi-Fi and small cells in conjunction with larger cells, coordinated transmission, that's called COMP. So there's a lot of technologies coming down that will help with some of the capacity issues. Nevertheless, what happens when you introduce those new technologies is that your network management practices are almost completely changed. Every cell site that starts to implement a new form of smart antenna algorithm to increase the cell site, it means readjusting the network of that cell site as well as the other cell sites around it. So it's moving so fast that it's just really hard to predict. And if you can't predict it, how can you regulate it?
Well, it's interesting. So I find that often regulation is motivated by a technological vision of the network and a use case you're trying to solve. And the use case that's motivating us right now tends to be video. You know, this sort of large, what happens when we move to different use cases? I mean, it's fascinating because Professor Reed, you mentioned that, you know, we don't know what the killer app is going to be in the future. And if we all knew, we wouldn't be here right now. We'd be sitting, clipping coupons on the beach, doing something very, very nice. You know, I'm just trying to think, you know, what is the structure that will allow us to evolve into this and to make it work? And the other question I have is, you mentioned LTE Advanced. You know, we say that we're the leaders of the world. Well, LTE Advanced is deploying in Korea. It's deploying in Australia. You know, how do we create an environment in which we have we maintain, no, not every country can be the leader, but, you know, the investments and the advancements we need to keep up?
I think that's a great question. We have done very well in this country with LTE. We are one of the early adopters. We've adopted it at a mass scale faster than just about any country. Korea has done well. If we have additional burdens in terms of the way that we manage these networks, I'm afraid that we're going to lose our edge as being the rapid adopting country. That other countries, because they have less impediments, will start to adopt the technology quicker. And adoption of new technology is very important for economic development. This country has become a center for developing apps, and the apps have been just a fantastic new addition to economic growth. And if we don't have the technology, the leading edge technology that the apps can be written around, then some other country's going to take that.
One thing I've noticed in the debate between more and less regulation is the amount of faith that each side is putting in people like Dr. Reed, right? So the argument from projecting into the future, right? You can think of it as sort of like a Malthusian argument. Thomas Malthus was very famous for saying, you know, population's going like this and food's going like this, and so eventually we're just going to run out of food and everybody's going to die. And what he didn't realize was that, you know, innovations in farming was going to increase the rate of food per square foot or farmland or whatever, and so we were going to be able to close that gap through technology. We see a lot of that in the argument between those who prefer more regulation, those who prefer less. The regulatory case is largely, I see where the trends are going now, assuming no future technological advancement, right? We can plan out a case and very carefully manage the internet of the future. There's some comfort in that because it's stable, right? You have a world that's centrally planned, you know what you're going to get. But the stability comes at the cost of innovation, right? What you're missing out on is all the things that you would have discovered if you had not been constrained by regulation. And so those who are on the other side of the fence understand that we're sacrificing some amount of stability and security. We recognize there's a risk going forward that we're going to run out of spectrum, for example. We're putting a lot of faith in you guys to solve that problem for us in order to be able to continue to innovate and invent new things that regulators themselves couldn't even think of.
We have time for one more question. And if there isn't one, I'll get to ask it. Please.
Tom Struble, Tech Freedom. This is more of a general question, but the title of this conversation, should wireless technologies be regulated differently, presumably encompasses both fixed and mobile wireless, and the two are comparable in many respects, similar constraints, spectrum, and interference, but different in some respects too, notably mobility. So my question is, to what extent should the regulatory framework account for those differences and perhaps treat fixed wireless more akin to wireline because they're more in the nature of substitutes versus mobile wireless is more of a complement?
And if I can get you to ask that, is fixed wireless, do we think of it as a substitute for fixed line as well? Because that's implicit in the question.
Well, I don't think wireless is going to support 4K Ultra TV anytime soon. So, you know, wireless is a substitute for voice. Okay. But for some of the new emerging applications, because of bandwidth constraints, mobility constraints, the channels are quite different. It's just night and day in terms of the differences in the network and how you manage it. It's just very different.
I remember when I was a teenager, my dad got in a fight with our local cable company. And he refused to pay a bill, and so we got our cable service cut off. And my dad was the kind of person who could not live without cable. And so he went out and found a wireless cable provider. We mounted the service. I think this was before Dish and DirecTV became really popular alternatives. And it was okay. It was not great. There were definitely downsides to it. It was the same price for a lower quality of service, but ultimately went out of business because it turns out that the technology was not really feasible. I think the FCC is, in the same way they didn't know what to do with wireless cable then, they're not really sure what to do with wireless ISPs now, right? Whenever you look at these orders, it's like in a footnote, oh yeah, and there's wireless ISPs, right? I think until the technology advances a little more and shows a sustainable business model that can be scaled, it's not really clear which regulatory bucket to put them in.
Just say one thing on before you dismiss fixed wireless too much. If you're in a rural area, it may be by far your best choice, or you may be quite happy to have it come. So that's one of the things I think also may be worth thinking about, that to the extent it's a technology that is being used in places where the business case may be pretty marginal, and certainly is for other technologies, you may want to think about, again, I would want a light touch on the regulation no matter what, but if you are going to regulate, I think it is a place where you should give particular credence or have particular concern about the effects on carrier investment incentives.
Yeah. And the National Broadband Plan said the last 1%, that's an irreducible problem and likely to be wireless. And in fact, people make comments about this, but my friends who are doing satellite in rural areas saying it's made huge strides. I mean, it's a very interesting, dynamic world we're living in. Please join me in thanking the panelists for a very interesting discussion.